With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right. Even if the whole world is telling you to move. It is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Tactics on this Monday evening. Whether you're listening on YouTube, Facebook, Twitch, Periscope, however you're watching the show, we certainly appreciate you being with us. And we decided we'd try out a new time. We're kind of playing around with the schedule here a little bit, not to confuse anybody, just to see what time works for everyone, just to give you a little bit of variety. So by all means, if you're watching right now and you think that this is a much better time, a time that you'd be more likely to watch the show live, by all means, leave us a comment right here on the video, either on Facebook or YouTube, or you can always email us at Tactics Radio. So be sure to do that. Speaking of that and sort of the change up, I'm in the process of building a new studio. We're going to be moving into a new studio very soon, and we're very excited about that. Really looking forward to it. It's going to be much better for the show. It's going to be a lot easier on me when we finally do get it all done, but that is going to require a little bit of time. And we are going to continue to do shows for the rest of this week, Monday through Thursday. But after that, we're going to have to take a hiatus. There's just no way that we can continue to do shows and work on building the new studio at the same time, especially since I'm doing all the work. So that's going to take a little bit of time. We'll probably be gone for at least 1 week, maybe 2. Hopefully it won't be more than that. But we are going to be here this week primarily because of FFA, the FFA convention. For those of you who've been paying attention to my program for a while, been listening to me when I was on the radio, you know that we always do specials when the FFA convention comes to town. It's a state convention for the entire state of Alabama. There's going to be FFA members from all over the state coming in to compete in various events. And I'm also going to be judging a contest tomorrow for that. I'm going to be judging one of their debate contests, Parley Pro specifically. So a lot going on. It's going to be a very busy week for me, but because of that, we're hoping to bring you some programming that will cover the state convention. We've got Ag Night tomorrow at the Biscuits. They're going to be doing a lot of events that feature the FFA prominently, and so because of that, and also because of other events that are going on, it just makes sense to do a couple of specials on the FFA. So we're going to be doing that. We're going to be bringing you all the latest content. And we certainly do look forward to seeing a lot of our FFA members out there. This is a big event for us. We always have a really great time on the floor of the convention, and that's going to be no different this year. We're going to be bringing you a lot of guests, a lot of interviews. So be sure to watch for that for the remainder of this week. And don't forget that tomorrow we have scheduled Becky Garrettson on to give us an update, sort of a wrap-up of what all was going on during the legislative session. So be sure to keep an eye out for that. We certainly are excited to have Becky Garrettson back on with us to sort of give us a wrap-up on the legislative session this year, because our legislature is no longer in session. Alabama's Congress gavelled for the last time this year unless they have a special session. So we certainly do want to figure out what all is going on there. So all that being said, I know that was a mountain of information. Let's go ahead and get to the news, because I think that this is a really important story, not just from a local standpoint, but also from a spiritual standpoint. So for those of you that are unaware about this, the Methodist Church, it's the First Methodist Church of Birmingham, is actually having a wedding party for Mr. Ratburn. Now, if you've ever woken up and thought, am I living in a parallel universe? That was today. That was this day for me, because my top story of the day is talking about how a church is throwing an actual live in-person wedding party with refreshments and different things in Birmingham, of all places, for a gay cartoon rat marrying a gay cartoon aardvark. We are in strange times, people. I have no idea what's going on. And unfortunately, this is a feeling that's getting more and more common as I cover the news and as the news just continues to get stranger. But this one may take the cake. This may take the gay cartoon wedding cake, because I'm living in some kind of parallel universe to where this is happening in Alabama of all places, but especially considering that we're having actual wedding parties for the wedding of a fictitious gay cartoon rat that teaches school children. This is a weird, weird story. And it's just, I have no idea how we got to this point in our society. It's one of those things that I'm almost like, I want to quit being a part of the human race for a little while. But here we are. So this church up in Birmingham, the First Methodist Church up in Birmingham, is hosting this wedding party to celebrate the wedding. And this is all coming at the same week, or I guess it was the same week, because they announced it this past week, actually, and we're getting caught up from the weekend. So this happened at the same week that there is a church in England that is suggesting that they're probably going to cover up some crosses so that they can invite Muslims to come in and worship Allah in their temple. We are in strange, strange times. We've got churches here in the Bible Belt celebrating cartoon gay weddings, and then we have churches over in England opening their doors to celebrate worship to a false god. I mean, we are in weird, weird times. But I think both occasions really stem from a similar place, and we're going to talk about that here in a second. So just keep in mind that our churches are going way awry. And I don't consider myself a member of either of these two religions. Of course, you know the church that I go to. But nonetheless, when we've got people that are professing to be followers of Christ, professing to be Christians, doing stuff like this, I mean, it's very much sailing in uncharted water. So this was a statement by Rachel Morgan, who was the event coordinator who sort of organized this whole thing for the gay cartoon wedding celebration. And she said, "Weddings take places at churches all the time. So First Church seems like a perfect venue for the cartoon in my opinion. The church frequently communicates to the community that they are an, quote, open place for all, and I think this event reflects that statement." So they're really not hiding the ball here. You don't have to be a genius to look at that statement and figure out what is happening. The church is trying to normalize sin. That's what's going on. They're trying to normalize it because they're saying, oh, weddings take places in churches. So why don't we have a screening of a cartoon wedding, not a wedding, but a screening of a gay wedding in a church? What they're trying to do is they are trying to do the best that they can to normalize the sin. And that's really the purpose of them putting it in the cartoon in the first place. They're doing the best that they can to drill it into people's heads. No, there's nothing abnormal about this. There's nothing strange. It's perfectly fine, perfectly natural, perfectly normal, no different than a heterosexual wedding. Even though, considering that a little less than 2% of the U.S. population is actually homosexual, even if you didn't think that homosexuality was morally wrong, it would by definition be abnormal. Even if you don't think that there's anything wrong with it per se, it's still strange. It's still out of the norm. But nonetheless, they're doing the best that they can to drill this idea into people's heads that no, everything is normal, everything is fine, everything is natural. There's no reason to ask any questions about it. Let's just try to make it as normal as everything else could be. And so this is really the question that I pose to you. And I want you to sit down and think about this for a little bit. Let's just say you were the devil, that you were Satan, and you were doing the best that you could to try to bring people away from Christ, away from the teachings of God, away from the church. What would you do different? What would you do different? Because if I'm the devil and I'm trying to keep people as far away from Christ as humanly possible, then I wouldn't do it with a direct frontal assault on the church. I mean, you could do that, and that's certainly been done by the forces of darkness in the past, But why would you do that when it's so much easier to do it this way? To have churches that are actually preaching your doctrine, that are actually preaching the evil and wicked things. They're preaching that sin is okay and acceptable and ought to be celebrated. If you were the devil and you were trying to tempt people, I contend this is exactly the kind of thing that you would be doing. And of course, I contend that he's actually behind all this as well. But there was a great lesson that I think can be taken from a passage out of the Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. And there was a big section of that book. And so just so you know, Screwtape Letters is a Christian fiction book about a demon teaching a younger demon how to tempt people. Where he says that the fact that the patient, in other words, the man that they are tempting, is getting involved with church is nothing to be panicked about. That there are quite a few people that are loyal servants to Satan, even though they're in the pew of a church every single Sunday. And this is, of course, true. And see, this is the far more dangerous way to go about it. Because if you were the devil, if you were involved in this temptation, you would much rather somebody believe that they are righteous and believe that they are following Christ and not, than you would have them outside the church and aware of the fact that they're not following the precepts of God. If you could choose between the two, you'd much rather have somebody that is convinced of their righteousness and convicted that their celebration and engagement in sin is something that is condoned by God, than you would have them out sinning and kind of always aware, even if they know that they shouldn't be doing it, have that kind of awareness that they know they shouldn't be doing it, but they're doing it anyway. I mean, that's still a win for the devil. And as long as you are not walking in the light, as long as you're not following in the footsteps of Christ, you're going to be lost either way. But the point is, if he had his choice, he'd much rather somebody not be in open rebellion to God, but sort of covertly in rebellion against God. In other words, actually in rebellion of the teachings of the gospel, but believing that they themselves are doing the right thing by doing that and convincing others around them the same thing. Because a person like that is far less worried about being lost and far less likely to take an honest look at themselves and change their ways. If you were trying to prevent repentance, which of course is part of salvation, then this would be the way to do it. This would be the best way to ensure that the people that are going to hell are going there with the best of intentions and never questioning whether or not they're actually saved. And I know that that's harsh. I know that that makes some people uncomfortable, but it's the truth. And that's why I pose this question to you. If you were the devil, if you were actually the person engaging in this, if it was your job to make sure that this did not happen, what would you do differently? I contend you wouldn't do anything differently. This is the path that he has set us on. There's another quote in this article. I don't want children or people who are different to feel excluded. That's not the kind of world we want to live in. And we want children to be educated so they can see that there's not just one type of family. Everyone should feel represented. And this goes back to the reason that was underlying both of what we were talking about earlier. Whether you're talking about the wedding celebration of a gay cartoon rat, or you're talking about covering up the crosses and bringing in Muslims to worship a false god and helping expedite or helping engage in worship to another god. It all stems from the same idea. Postmodernism. You see, what's going on here is that in both cases, these churches have thrown out the gospel and accepted something completely different. The gospel of tolerance. That no matter what happens, no matter how evil it is, no matter how wrong it is, no matter whether or not Christ preached against it, doesn't matter. We have to accept it. You see, churches are supposed to be welcoming places. We're supposed to welcome people that are strangers, rich, poor, old, young, doesn't matter. But there's a difference in accepting that person who wants to come in, who wants to change, who wants to learn about the gospel. There's a difference in saying, come on in. We're all sinners here. There's a stark contrast in that and saying we're all sinners here and we want to stay that way. You see, if you think of the church as a hospital, a place where people come to find healing and truth and compassion from others, which is a pretty good analogy of what a church is, actually. You accept everybody, no matter how sick they are, no matter what their life status, no matter whether they're old or young, none of that. A good hospital is going to be one that accepts everybody. But they're not going to leave them sick. That would defeat the purpose of a hospital. And so what we're talking about here with the church is there are churches that have absorbed this idea of postmodernism that, well, there's actually lots of different revenues to get to God, which there's not. Jesus specifically said that there is one way, that there is only one path, and there are few there be that find it, and that he is the way to the Father, that nobody comes to the Father but by him. Jesus is very emphatic about that in several different places in the gospel. But so many churches, because they don't want to say anything that makes anybody uncomfortable, they would prefer to be acceptable and liked by everybody than they would to teach the truth. That they're perfectly fine with saying, hey, come on in, and by the way, you don't have to actually change anything about your life, which defeats the whole purpose of the gospel anyway. I mean, yes, the gospel is for everybody, but it's for everybody with a purpose. The gospel applies to anyone and can be accepted by anyone. But it also requires a change of heart and a change of lifestyle and a change of mind. The gospel by its very nature is intended to be transformative. And that's across the board. Whether you're a recent Christian that never heard of the gospel before, or you're somebody that's been teaching Bible classes for 60 years. The gospel is supposed to have a transformative effect on your life, because no human can live up to the laws of God on his own. And so a transformation is supposed to take place. But what so many of these churches now have done is they have thrown out the greater gospel command for love, and instead gone to the lower standard, which is tolerance. You see, the thing about Christian love is it tells the truth. You don't want to make the person feel bad. But if you have to choose between making the person feel bad and telling the truth, you tell the truth. The gospel is described many times as a sword. Well, you get cut by a sword, it's going to hurt. That happens sometimes when you're examining yourself and comparing yourself to the Scripture. But if you have to sacrifice truth, if you have to put truth on the back burner, you have to say, okay, well, these verses we're just not going to pay attention to because that tends to make people uncomfortable. Then you're not doing the work of God. You're not doing the work of the church. And you are completely nullifying the purpose of the gospel. Church was not made to make people feel good. The church was founded to save lost souls, period. It has no other purpose. To reconcile lost people to a holy God. That is the purpose of the church. And if you're not doing that, you can't call yourself a church. You can't call yourself a disciple of Christ. And yes, that makes people uncomfortable. But it's the truth. I think, I don't do this very often. But I think we're actually going to go straight into a chaplain's report. I think that it's honestly necessary at this point. I think it's about time we went straight into a chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps under the command of General George Washington Each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Chaplain's Report today does relate exactly to what we were talking about different churches basically throwing the gospel aside so that they can let other people feel better, so that they can be welcoming to everybody. That they have lowered their standards of truth and lowered their standards of following God's word so that they can meet the far smaller standard of tolerance. And what I mean by that is they would rather tolerate everybody than love them. They would rather be acceptable to other people than preach the truth of God's word. Rather than tell anybody that they're wrong. Because you think about it like a parent and a child. What parent loves their child more? The parent that never corrects their child at all and lets them do whatever they want? Or the parent that when they see the child doing something that might hurt themselves, they say, no. Hang on there. See, that's the parent that really loves their child. And Paul, in a lot of ways, felt like a parent, not in the same sense that God was, but Paul had sort of a parental demeanor when it came to some of the churches that he helped put together. And it was Paul and several other apostles that went through the region of Galatia and brought those churches about that started converting people that eventually grew into the various congregations. But unfortunately, the Galatians had a bad false teaching problem. That Paul had gone through that region and they started out strong. They were listening to the words of the apostles. They were following the gospel of Christ. And then a whole bunch of false teachers started saying things that the apostles never said. And started telling them that they had to do this and had to do that, and that they could ignore this and ignore that. They were teaching false doctrines. And Paul, even though he hadn't been gone that long from the region of Galatia, had already heard some very troubling reports about the Christians there. And that's part of the reason that he wrote this letter, and I think that there's a lot of relevance here today in our society. Because we have exactly the same thing going on. So this is what the Apostle Paul wrote to the Christians in Galatia, in Galatians 1, 6 through 10. I am amazed that you are so quickly deserting him who called you by the grace of Christ for a different gospel, which is really not another, only there are some who are disturbing you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we, or an angel from heaven, should preach to you a gospel contrary to what we have preached to you, he is to be accursed. As we have said before, so I say again now, if any man is preaching to you a gospel contrary to what you received, he is to be accursed. For I am now seeking the favor of men or God, or am I striving to please men? If I were still trying to please men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ. So, I don't see how you can read that verse and not immediately think of what's going on today. Because you look all throughout that passage, and I think this is actually something that's very comforting. Not that we're in the situation that we are, but that there are no new problems. That the church has been dealing with this since the first century. And this is something that has been going on for a very long time. False doctrine has always been a problem in the Lord's church. But you look at the way that Paul starts that passage out, and we could go for hours on this, but I'm just going to give you a quick summary here. He says, I am surprised that it took so little time for you to get off the right track. Because remember, Paul hasn't been gone from Galatia for very long. And he's already hearing these very disturbing reports of people preaching things that the apostles never said and are not in agreement with the gospel that is being taught. And he says that they are calling him away from the gospel of the grace of Christ, which, can you get any better than that? You're really going to try to improve on the Son of God coming down from heaven to die for your sins, you're going to somehow tweak that story and make it better? He's saying, why would you leave that for this false doctrine that is being peddled amongst your members? And he says that there are those around here that are trying to distort the gospel of Christ, which is exactly what's happening here, whether you're talking about being accepting of other religions and saying that they're perfectly okay, or whether it's accepting of things like homosexuality or abortion or any other number of hot-button issues. There are people trying to twist the gospel into saying something that it doesn't to fit their own personal agenda, to fit what they want the gospel to say, rather than changing themselves to try to fit what the gospel says. It's a fine but very important distinction. But I really love this next line that Paul gives here. He says that even if we, talking about the apostles, even if we start saying things that are contrary to the gospel, don't listen to us. You see, Paul understood that human beings are fragile. Human beings are fallible. They make mistakes. And so he is putting himself accountable here, saying, if I start preaching things that is the opposite of what I told you beforehand, which was revelation from the Holy Spirit, in other words, if people start telling you that the scripture says something else, that person is to be accursed even if I do it. Paul was setting himself up and saying, you guys need to hold even me accountable. The scripture is the absolute word of God. Anybody, I don't care who they are, even if they are an apostle, or you see an angel descend from heaven and tell you this gospel, if they're telling you something that is contrary to the scripture, you don't listen. That person is to be accursed. See, Paul wasn't somebody that said, listen to my thoughts on what the Bible says. He says, just read the gospel. We gave it to you for a reason. And if anybody tells you anything contrary to that, you don't listen to that person. Paul didn't even want them to heed his words in case he went off the rails. And there's a reason for that. This is a very strong case for understanding that the Bible is God's absolute word, and anybody that strays from that is somebody that is not to be heeded, not to be listened to. There's a reason God made one single standard, a measuring stick by which everybody else could be measured. Because otherwise, it's all just a bunch of opinions and it's all subjective. That's not what God wanted. That would make God, by definition, unfair. If he left the salvation of your immortal soul up to chance, and if you just happen to think the right thing at that time, that would make God incredibly unfair. That's why God wrote it down, made a standard, and said everybody has to live by this. Religious leaders have to live by this. Apostles have to live by this. This is absolute truth, and anybody saying anything other than this, don't listen to that person. That's what Paul is saying here. And then he goes a little bit further down and again says, just repeats himself for emphasis. Says if anybody says anything contrary to what we've been saying, let him be accursed. So he's just repeats himself again there in verse 9. And then in verse 10, I think this is where this really hits home, because this is the epitome of what is going on in the larger Christian community as a whole. In other words, every denomination of Christianity, and what's going on in the Lord's church. It's happening everywhere. There is nobody immune to it. Don't ever think that just because your church is scripturally sound now that you think, well, this couldn't happen here. No, Paul is saying that this is a widespread problem, and you have to be ever vigilant to stay on the path to stay true to the scripture. And in verse 10, we see why. For am I now seeking the favor of men or of God, or am I striving to please men? If I were still trying to please men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ. So this is where Paul really puts the cherry on top of the sundae. He's saying, I'm in chains. Do you really think that I care what people think? Do you really think that I am concerned about being accepting and tolerant of everybody and what other people want to hear? Because if that were the case, I'm pretty sure I would not be persecuted right now because of Christ. Now, this was not a prison epistle, so Paul wasn't in prison when he was writing this, but Paul was a person that had already felt the wrath of local officials and religious leaders in Jerusalem. Paul has already faced a fair deal of religious persecution at this point. And he's essentially saying, and he'll say this more specifically in other parts of his writings, what is the purpose of going through all this, facing this persecution, being shipwrecked and being imprisoned and being beaten and stoned to death and run out of various towns? What's the point if it wasn't to bring people the truth of the gospel? Paul got it. He was saying, yes, it's going to make people uncomfortable. Yes, it's going to make some people angry. But if you have to choose between teaching the truth and pleasing people, in other words, pleasing God or pleasing men, you go with pleasing God. It's not always going to be pretty. Sometimes it's going to hurt. But it's what we're supposed to do as Christians. It's what Christ himself did, and we're supposed to model our lives after him. And so Paul understands here, he's saying, if I'm not here to please men, and you're not here to please men. So when you're making decisions on stuff like this, that should not be your primary concern. Churches ought to be a place where people can come in and feel welcomed and safe. But if you think that that's a place that nobody should ever feel uncomfortable or nobody should ever be challenged, or that the truth can just be kind of put to the side so that we can say some things that make people feel better about themselves, you've got the gospel all wrong. And that's really the message that Paul is putting out here. I think that that's really at the crux of everything that Paul is saying. All right, so what we're going to do is, because we've already done the chaplain's report now, so I guess that'll just be the chaplain's report for the day. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back in just a second.
And now for a reading from the Social Justice Warrior Bible with Pastor Gregory Post.
Welcome in. I'm Gregory Post, head pastor at the Eternal Living Word Trans-Denominational Community Church and Coffee House in Novato, California. And now for a reading from the SJW Bible. Today's reading will be from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 7, verses 2 through 10. And a centurion's slave was sick and about to die. When he had heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders asking him to come save the life of his slave. When they came to Jesus, they earnestly implored him, saying, "He is worthy for you to grant this to him, for he loves our nation, and it was he who built our synagogue." Now Jesus was triggered upon hearing this and said, "None of the good things he has done matter, because he is a slave owner, and we must never admit that anyone that ever owned slaves is capable of doing anything good. Furthermore, instead of asking me for help, you should have passed universal health care by now so that he could receive treatment for free." Then Jesus started on his way with them, and when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying, "Lord, do not trouble yourself further, for I am not worthy for you to come under my roof. For this reason I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I am also a man placed under authority, with soldiers under me, and I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and he does it." Now when Jesus heard this, he marveled at him, and turned and said to the crowd that was following him, "I say to you, this man is engaged in systematic oppression. He is clearly engaging in wage slavery by controlling the means of production to exploit the labor of those around him." Then Jesus gathered up a mob and protested on the centurion's lawn all night long with torches and signs reading, "Down with the patriarchy," terrifying him and his family. We never really found out what happened to the centurion's slave. Wow. So inspiring. Thank you for listening to this reading of the SJW Bible, and remember, the only truth that matters is your truth.
Welcome back, all. We do have some more local news to get to today. So, AL.com, doing some incredible journalisming over there at AL.com. And, I use AL.com as a source pretty regularly. And by and large, they do a decent job. But sometimes that left-leaning bias just comes out. And this was no difference. Kind of actually going along with what we were talking about. They do this big thing about Pride Month being kicked off, and you can just see the bias pretty regularly. They put a little emoji up there celebrating it, and then they have on the bottom there 6 key players in Alabama's historic Rainbow Crosswalk. Historic Rainbow Crosswalk? How long has it been there? Like 3 years? I don't really consider the Rainbow Crosswalk historic, but again, they have to paint everything in rose-colored glasses because, of course, this is just what AL.com does. They have a pretty clear left-leaning bias, and they usually do a decent job of keeping it in check, but boy, sometimes they just let it fly. Anyway, so that's AL.com on Gay Pride Month, which I've always really despised the fact that it's in June, but nonetheless, that's, the way that it is, just because it happens to be my birthday month, but nonetheless. AL.com also kind of let their liberal bias show with a piece going after Alabama for its lax gun laws. So there's a couple pieces that I wanted to mention, a couple little excerpts out of this piece. And I do actually think, just so you know, before we dive into it, there actually are some really good points in here. Now, the overall tone and the overall, what seems to be the author's conclusion, I think is wildly incorrect. But there are a couple of points that we can take out of this that I actually would agree with. So I want you to sort of listen for those nuggets while I'm reading this. Despite heavy restrictions on funding for gun-related research in this country, many medical and public health organizations believe a public health approach is the best path toward better understanding the root causes of violence. Okay, so there's a lot in that statement that I actually agree with. First of all, there is a restriction, there are several restrictions on funding for gun-related research, which I don't necessarily understand. Now, as far as there being restrictions on different organizations, if it's a spending issue, in other words, you don't want organizations spending money on research for gun violence when their department has nothing to do with it, I kind of understand that. But honestly, the data isn't great for some of these things, specifically because there has been a lack of spending. But the answer the answer to that, if you're asking me, is to do it privately funded. Because there have been privately funded efforts to get a handle on gun violence and those kind of statistics for a long time anyway. You've got the Crime Prevention Research Center, you have the NRA does some of this, and then you've also got left-leaning groups like Everytown for Gun Safety. Now, because some of those groups have a bias, some of their data is garbage. But the point is, if you have a problem with spending restrictions on the government, the best and simplest solution to that problem, even though I don't necessarily agree with the restrictions, at least in some cases, the best solution to that is to figure out a way to fund the research yourself. Because there are private organizations, whether you're talking about media organizations or research organizations or different colleges and universities that do stuff like this all the time. And so if it is something that is important, and I believe it is, and it's data that I think would be helpful, and I believe it is, then let those organizations take care of it. There's no reason to depend on the government for absolutely everything, or to say because there are certain restrictions on the government that, oh no, it looks like there's nothing we can do about it. No, I mean, if you have a problem with that, find an organization that has the means and has the willingness to do something like this and get it done. It's just that simple. But the second part of that statement, the understanding that there's a public health aspect to this, would help understanding the root causes of the violence. I don't think that's entirely incorrect. Now, I am hesitant to full-on sign on to this, because when you start talking about violence as some kind of public health crisis, you're almost excusing it. It kind of goes back to what we were talking about a couple weeks ago with the education system basically coming up with things like I don't even remember the scientific name for it, even though I don't think there was a whole lot of science involved in the first place. The new mental health disorder that basically encompasses every behavior that every child has ever done in their lifetime. That it would just sort of be an umbrella term to be, if a child is acting up, they have some kind of mental disorder. You do run the risk of that. You run the risk of these different events, in the case of gun violence, being dismissed as, oh, well, that's like getting the measles, or, well, actually, measles is a bad example because there's actually a vaccine for that, even though there aren't some people that are using it now. That would be almost like saying, well, it's like the common cold. You can't help that you committed gun violence. You run that risk because people can help that they committed gun violence, and it is a criminal justice problem that needs a criminal justice solution. Now, the underlying risk factors for said violence, the underlying risk factors for that, for example, if you want to prevent lung cancer, you get the word out that smoking can cause that and help reduce the risk factor of that. Now, if we're talking about risk factors, I understand taking a little bit more of a illness approach to it, a public health concern thing to it, and look at some of the underlying causes to try to figure out, why is this happening? That I'm fine with. What I don't like is the implication here, which I think is actually being made, that we should treat gun violence as though it's just a public health crisis. No, people don't choose to get the common cold. People don't choose to get swine flu. People absolutely choose to pick up a gun and start killing people. That's a choice. And because that is a criminal activity, we can't just treat it as though it's some epidemic that just happened upon a city, that a whole bunch of people decided, oh, let's just pick up guns and kill people. That's not a disease in that sense. Now, there may be people with mental problems that they're not necessarily in full control of their own faculties, where I think that logic could be applied. And that's typically what happens in the case of a lot of these mass shootings, is that there are people with severe mental problems that either aren't treated or are not treated properly. And so from that standpoint, I think there is actually some value in the statement. I'm just careful of going too far, and I think that this is the direction that they're trying to lead you in, saying that, well, it's just an epidemic and you can't really do anything about it. So, it looks like we've got a caller on line one, so we'll go ahead and go to the phones. Good evening. What's your name?
Hey, good evening. How are you?
Doing good. So what's your take on this whole AL.com piece about guns and saying that Alabama's gun laws are the reason that we've got so many gun deaths?
Yeah, well, I mean, there isn't backing on that, I don't think. And that's just one of those things to get attention, to also continue the stereotype of our state. I mean, I think that's what is the motivation here.
So you just think it's...
Though.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, yeah.
I was just going to say that what I was going to try to help you with was the disorder, the defiance disorder.
Yeah. What is it? Operational defiance disorder?
Optional defiance disorder.
Optional defiance disorder. I knew there was an O in there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's one of those things, as you said earlier, it covers everything.
Yeah.
At any kind of poor behavior in a kid is covered under that umbrella.
Right, and that's... I see a similar thought pattern going on here, and this is a problem really between leftist thought and people that happen to be on the right in the way they think about things. Typically speaking, people that tend to be more politically liberal, they blame a lot of society's problems on society itself.
Oh, I was going to say that.
Right.
Because of a mass shooter you have to blame it on society.
Right.
I mean, there always has to be a societal reason for it, and it's society's fault. And most of the time, you bring it back to the conservative thought process as to why it transpires that, or it ultimately leads to that anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Progressives were in charge, that wouldn't happen, or at least they act like that wouldn't happen.
Well,
and you think I'm on the right track there?
Yeah, I think you are, but it kind of reminds me, and by the way, I have some beef with Mitch McConnell on this here recently, trying to raise the smoking age to 21 federally. But they almost treat it as though when it comes to guns, that the problem is that the guns are there. And it's almost like what they try to do is they try to tackle it from the angle of, well, if we just got guns out of the environment, then there would be no more violence and people wouldn't try to hurt one another. But they try to do the same thing with things like smoking laws. The idea is, well, let's just get the cigarettes out of the environment and then people won't smoke. You really think people aren't going to try to smoke just because you take the cigarettes away from them? Have you ever been around somebody that's trying to quit smoking?
Yeah, whatever it takes. And
but it ultimately goes down to they're trying to blame the inanimate object and they're trying to blame the environment rather than blaming the person for making bad decisions. That's what it boils down to.
They don't believe in people taking responsibility for their actions.
Right.
They believe that practically everyone in prison, it really isn't their fault. It's society's fault.
Well, that's why the Bernie Sanders is saying that everybody in prison ought to vote.
Yeah, because they think you shouldn't lose your right to vote just because you killed 18 people.
Well, and like you were saying, though, in their mind, you're just a victim of your circumstances. The reason that person killed 18 people is because he grew up in a rough neighborhood. And that makes it okay for him to do bad things.
Right, and that's a dangerous. Of course, it's a dangerous mindset because when you don't hold people responsible for their actions, then that's how you can get to the chaos that they'd like to have all the time anyway.
Well, and you know this as an educator too. You cannot, for 18 years, give a child no responsibility, treat him like he can't do anything, and then at 18 just sit there scratching your head wondering why he's not responsible.
Sure.
Like, you have to hold people responsible for their actions for them to learn responsibility. They won't learn it any other way.
More times than not, you get the kind of kid at the end of 18 years after the education and everything, you get the kind of kid that you produce.
Yeah.
I mean, you do. If you don't give them responsibility and let them take that on, and I mean, in my day, you grew up with it because it was expected of you early on.
Yeah, I mean,
and you didn't even think about foregoing when you start working on a farm when you're 9 years old. It's just automatically assumed you can't imagine not having responsibility and taking it upon yourself to make your way in this life and that kind of thing. You don't wait on someone else to do it for you. It never even crosses your mind to say, well, gosh, I wonder how the government's going to help me with this.
Right. Well, I mean, you look back, for example, at the Greatest Generation. That was a generation which is incredibly responsible, but look at what they went through. When, like you said, when you're 9 years old and you're expected to work on a farm and you know if you don't do your part, your family might starve, that's a lot of pressure to put on a 9-year-old.
Yeah. Well, that's just like the icon
and then when
I mentioned to you today that was 97 years old and flew a plane in Europe and was shot at, raised through the Depression, then went overseas when he was 20 years old and was a veteran and then worked all of his life and farmed and education and everything else. And, man, that's the generation that made the nation what it is.
Right. And when you realize the level of adversity that they had to go through both as children and, like you said, as a young adult, when you're storming a beach at 6 a.m. and know that if you mess up or you don't do your part, the freedom of mankind might not pan out. That develops you into a kind of person that thinks in a responsible manner. And I'm glad that our generation doesn't have to deal with that, but we need to have responsibility in some capacity.
I would bet both arms that AOC would describe the gentleman I just mentioned to you as white privilege.
Probably so. All right. Well, thank you so much for your call. Sure. I appreciate it. But here's the thing about it. Even looking at it from this perspective, which I do think is a skewed perspective, the crux and the stats that this whole article is predicated on don't even really work. Because if you're looking at this article, it says in 2017 in Alabama, 1,100 people died from complications of gunshot wounds, 573 suicides, 506 homicides, and 21 accidental discharges, according to the Alabama Department of Health. Each of those deaths contributed to the Center for Disease Control naming Alabama second deadliest in the nation for firearm fatalities. Yeah, here's the problem with that, though. You're including anybody that died in relation to a firearm. And as you pointed out in your own stats, that of that 1,100 people, 506 were homicides, so about half were homicides. But you've also got 573, more than half, suicides, and then you also have 21 accidental discharges. In other words, the person didn't even intend for the gun to go off. Some kind of accident occurred. So the problem with that is, you're adding in suicides. People that commit suicide are going to commit suicide regardless of whether they have a gun available to them. Obviously, in a gun-rich state like Alabama, where there's a gun practically in every pickup truck, you're going to have a lot more suicides that were conducted by gun. And I do think that it is you want to talk about a public health concern, it is very alarming that we're seeing a spike in suicides over the entire country. But that is not a problem of the gun. That is a problem with the person. To prove the point, if you look at suicide rates overall, over the entirety of the world, some of the countries that have the highest suicide rates have the lowest access to guns, including Japan and China. Ridiculously high suicide rates. Even though they don't actually own a lot of guns. They're still killing themselves, they're just using another way to do it. Their suicide rate is actually much higher than the United States, even though we have way more guns. And so it's completely disingenuous for AL.com to try to use gun suicides to bolster their statistics and talk about how, well, that's really the reason. Well, that's over half, even more than homicides, is suicides, which would cut your figure in half. And gun suicides are obviously going to be higher in a gun-rich state like Alabama compared to other states that don't have nearly as many gun suicides because the average person doesn't have a gun handy. Here's another thing to consider, and it breaks my heart to report this, but it is the truth. Because Alabama is a heavy military state, in other words, we got a lot of military people right here in the city of Montgomery. We've got 2 Air Force bases. Suicide rates, especially with guns, are much higher amongst military personnel. And that is a horrible, tragic thing, but you have to realize that that is going to affect the numbers. That is going to give you a skewed view of the stats if you're including suicides as a part of your statistics. So it's just completely dishonest by AL.com to use suicides as a way to pad the statistics and try to make it look as though gun violence in the state is much worse than it actually is. To prove my point, got a couple of graphics here to help you really understand this. This is a gun homicide rate. So this is just looking at gun homicides per 100,000 people. Now you will notice, looking at the statistic, that if you're looking at the Deep South, you've got Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, Georgia, South Carolina, all pretty much neck and neck, and all on the higher level of this. But look at some of the other gun-rich states. Vermont has virtually no gun homicides, despite the fact that it's a pretty gun-rich state and it has very lax gun carry laws. You've also got Utah and Idaho that are very gun-rich, Montana, Alaska, Texas, which aren't nearly as much, and then you've also got several states here, like Illinois, that have an awful lot of gun suicides, despite having incredibly strict gun laws. Same thing with Michigan. So the problem with this is, when you look at it, Alabama is not a massive outlier. It's not as though Alabama's gun policy or its gun laws have created some kind of health epidemic, which is the case that this article is trying to make, where gun homicides and killing in the streets, which is the imagery it's trying to bring up, is far more common in Alabama than it is anywhere else. It's simply not true, and it's dishonest to make that case based upon a number that is inflated to look worse than it actually is. You're playing with the numbers and putting an image in people's heads that is not equivalent, not accurate, and not true to the statistics that you're given. That's really what's going on here. And I do applaud AL.com for including the breakdown of showing how many of them were suicides and homicides. But I'm saying the way that they're trying to drum up this imagery is disingenuous. But even in the case of gun homicides, homicides aren't even a perfect metric for this. Because you have to keep in mind that according to the CDC study, again, the same source that is using that their stats are being used by AL.com, that at least 3 to 5 times more often than a gun is used for a murder or a violent crime, a gun is used to protect somebody. And guess what that gets counted as? A gun homicide. Because homicide is not illegal. There are certain things as justifiable homicide. If a man breaks into my house and I shoot him, that counts as a gun homicide. But it's a case of a gun actually being used to defend somebody, as opposed to murder someone. And so even the gun homicide rate isn't a perfect metric. It's a far better metric than suicides. But this idea that the gun homicide rate in and of itself is indicative of a larger problem with gun crime, that's not even necessarily true, because a big chunk of the homicides in any given state, regardless of what you're talking about, are going to be defensive use of firearms. And so there is a stark contrast there. So I want you to go ahead and look at this graphic, which helps you understand this a little bit better. So this is the same map that you just saw on the left of gun homicides per 100,000 residents, so that is adjusted for population. Now, look at that map there on the right. That is the percentage of the population that owns guns. Not percentage of guns themselves, but the percentage of gun owners. How big a percentage of your population owns guns? You see a big difference there? You see, if you're looking up at the top left corner, you'll see that Idaho and Montana and Wyoming have incredibly high rates of gun ownership and very, very low rates of gun homicide. And then you've also got Texas, which has a very high rate of gun ownership and only moderate rates of gun homicide. And the same could be said of Alaska. Alaska has a lot of guns per person and is about middle of the pack on gun homicides. Same for West Virginia, very low gun homicides there. The point in all of this is you have a very low percentage in states like Illinois, Missouri, Michigan, and yet you have a moderate to high level of gun homicides here. Look over there at Maryland. Maryland has a lot of homicides, even though a very small percentage of its population actually owns guns. And so once you compare these maps and look at them side by side, you very quickly realize that there is no correlation whatsoever between the amount of citizenry owning guns and the amount of gun homicides that you have. So this idea that more guns equals more crime, and the more people you have, the more lax gun laws you have, the more problems you're going to have with violent gun crimes, it's just not true. By any objective rubric looking at the data, there is no correlation. Now, there is a pretty strong correlation between things like poverty, and there's a pretty strong correlation between things like just in general education, access to higher paying jobs. There is a correlation between that, which unfortunately Alabama has a very high rate of poverty compared to other states, and gun crime. That's true. But it's a far better indicator. In fact, gun ownership is not an indicator whatsoever of whether or not you have a high level of gun homicides. And if you notice that lack of correlation, you will very quickly realize that there is a big difference there. So let's go ahead and look at this, because I do think this alarmism over Alabama's quote-unquote gun deaths, which includes gun homicides, is incorrect. So this is a state, they took a look at the gun homicide rate from 1990 to now. And you will notice that on this chart, Alabama is not number 2. Alabama is not even close to number 2. Alabama is way far down at number 24. And actually, if you're looking at it, we have a 14.8 rate drop. So out of 100,000 people, we've actually decreased our gun homicide rate by 14.8 since the 1990s. And we're about middle of the pack as far as the decrease in homicide rate goes. So if you were to read this AL.com article without proper context and without doing your research, you would think, oh my gosh, gun homicides are just skyrocketing in the state of Alabama. We have a real problem on our hands. But if you're looking at us compared to other states, and you're looking at the relative change in gun homicide rate, actually Alabama is moving in the right direction. And if you'll look at this one, because let's just say, for the sake of argument, that gun death rate was a reliable source. Maybe we could at least say that Alabama has a real problem with gun suicides, and I just laid out the case for why there's a lot of contributing factors to the gun suicide rate in Alabama not being what it should, and we can always make improvement. But take a look at this graphic, because this looks specifically at the suicide rate. You'll notice even in the gun suicide rate, even when you're specifically just looking at people that kill themselves with guns, Alabama is still on the decrease. We are still 22nd with a 0.4 rate drop. So where is this crisis that AL.com is telling us is going on here? By both metrics, even though gun suicide is by no means an argument for stricter gun laws, even if you're looking at that statistic, we're still not anywhere near the top. And look at some of the states that are. You've got some that have pretty loose gun laws, but you've also got, for example, New Hampshire and Delaware. Not exactly bastions of conservative thought and Second Amendment lovers. You saw the chart a second ago where they have very, very low per capita gun ownership. So this idea that somehow, because there is the CDC named us the second worst state for gun deaths, well, when you dig into the data, it actually doesn't back that up. And when you dig into the data, we're actually on the right track. We're moving down in both of those. Now, are there things that we could do to move even further down? Yeah, I think so. Are there areas that we could improve, and is this a legitimate conversation to have? Yeah, I absolutely think that's the case. If you want to have an intelligent adult conversation about ways that we can decrease gun violence and decrease gun suicides, I'm in favor of that. But this idea that there is some kind of alarmism, that there is some great existential crisis on our hands and we have to act now and we have to go ahead and remove everybody's Second Amendment rights so that we can get closer to that. Yeah, the states that are doing that aren't having any results. There's a lot of states that are doing that are actually in worse shape than Alabama is. And so if you want to have that conversation, that's fine, but we have to have it honestly. We have to have it based on actual stats, actual numbers, and we have to look at the other states by comparison to see if what they're doing is working. And one thing is very clear, the more you dig into these stats, that gun laws have virtually no effect whatsoever on gun crime, and it has very little effect on gun suicides. Ready access to guns and the ability to exercise your Second Amendment rights doesn't necessarily bring crime down, but failure to allow citizens to exercise those rights certainly does end in a lack of freedom and doesn't do anything to help with your crime stats, which is the reason by any objective measure, it's a really, really bad idea to do. And you remember how I told you that even the gun homicide rate isn't 100%, 100% accurate, that there's a lot of those homicides that just do not add up? Well, if you look at Alabama's gun murder rate, in other words, specifically people that used a gun to commit a murder, per 100,000 people, Alabama has 4.2. By the way, that is 22nd overall. Not even close to the top. We don't even crack the top 10. Gun crime is always going to be a problem, and always one that I am willing to have a discussion on how we can limit it. But this idea that we ought to be taking away people's Second Amendment rights to do it, I'm sorry, but the data shows that all you end up with when you do that is citizens that are no longer able to defend themselves. The criminals still have guns. The criminals still commit crimes. Just like the states that we were looking at with very high levels of crime, gun homicide and suicide, or gun homicide and murder rates. Illinois, Michigan, and Delaware is on the rise now. This idea that we need to take away people's liberties in order to make them more secure never works. And the numbers show that once you've dug into them. And the truth is, there are aspects of this that I absolutely agree with. There are aspects of this article saying that we need to take this seriously, we need to look at ways to decrease it. I'm 100% in favor of having that discussion. But that's not what you're doing. You're not presenting the data in such a way that makes people ask more questions or look at real solutions that might work. What you're doing is fear-mongering to push a certain political agenda, and that doesn't help anybody. Let's go to the Daily Dose of Stupid.
That was stupid.
I know it was stupid.
Really stupid.
Hey, I just said it was stupid.
Now, today's Daily Dose of Stupid, I really hate to do this, because even though I am by no means a fan of this person, and by that I don't mean that I have any personal animus, I just mean that as an artist, I don't get the appeal. I got to go after Taylor Swift a little bit today. So Taylor Swift, who I think is one of the most brilliant businesswomen in the music industry. I don't like her music. The sort of pop country thing, I just don't get. It's not my cup of tea. I think you know that if you've paid attention to my radio career, I'm definitely a classic rock guy. So it's just not my thing. I appreciate her talent, but I just don't personally like her genre of music. And that's fine. I still think she's one of the sharpest businesswomen in the country music industry, or in the music industry as a whole, because really, she gets played more on Y102 here at Cumulus Media than she does at WLWI. So she's really even more in the pop genre than she is in the country genre now. But nonetheless, she is one of the sharpest businesswomen in the music industry. And there's a couple different examples. I won't go into great detail. I'll share just one with you real quick. I heard a friend of mine that is a fan mention that she was playing the Friends theme song at one of her concerts. Now, her fan base, her primary fan base, are a bunch of teenage and preteen girls who were not even conceived yet when Friends was making a run, in many cases. Or if they were conceived or they were born, they certainly were not old enough to remember being friends of the fans of the Friends sitcom. The reason she was doing that is because she's drawing in the parents. She knows the parents need to be at the concert for the daughters, and so they do a little something for the parents to keep them entertained, to give them a little bit of nostalgia for that. I mean, she's a brilliant businesswoman. Very, very sharp. And she's a heck of an entertainer. But Taylor Swift's done something pretty stupid. One of the things that I always admired about her, even though, like I said, I just wasn't really somebody that followed her career just because I didn't really appreciate what she was doing in the sense that it wasn't something that I wanted to listen to, I always had a great deal of respect for her because she didn't get political. She did the smart thing, which was get on stage, perform, do what she's there to do, and that was it. And I'm not somebody that takes the Laura Ingraham angle on this. I'm not the kind of person, what I mean by that is I'm not the kind of person that says just shut up and dribble, or just shut up and sing. Because they're citizens too. They have a right to do or say whatever they want. The fact that they have a big platform, that just kind of comes with the territory. In fact, one of my favorite musicians, John Rich of Big and Rich, he's a pretty political guy, and he speaks out about his political opinions. That's okay. I don't have a problem with that, but you have to admit, whether you agree with the person or not, it is smarter not to get into politics. Because if your goal is just to be a good entertainer and make a lot of money, especially when you are your brand the way that Taylor Swift is. The smartest thing that you can do is to just never talk about it, because you will never alienate any portion of your possible fan base. Obviously, when you're in the news business or you're a political commentator, that's impossible, but when you're an entertainer, you can do that if you want to. You can spread your influence further, and you can make a lot more money doing that. And I always really admired the fact that she had the conviction to, even though I was always certain that she had political ideas, she never really shared them and just kind of kept them to herself. From a business standpoint, it's a much smarter model. But Taylor Swift has come out this week in a new interview with her about her new album in Elle magazine and says, quote, "I definitely think there are political undertones in the new music I made. I'm not planning to stop encouraging young people to vote and to try to get them to talk about what's going on in our country. I think that's one of the most important things I could do." So to understand sort of the context around that, for the longest time, Taylor Swift was known for telling people to go out and vote, but not telling them how to vote or her opinions on any of the candidates or the issues. So she just kind of, in a very generic way, said to young people, it's important that you vote, but didn't really consider it her job, or I guess it didn't up until this point, to talk about the actual politics and the issues themselves. She broke that silence when it came to the midterm election. And I'm certain, as a very popular young starlet that a lot of people listen to, that has a really, really big platform like that, I can imagine that it would be very tempting to break that silence and ramble on about your political ideas. A lot of people do. Most entertainers do. But the thing is, and this is why I think that this falls into the daily dose of stupid, if you're a Taylor Swift fan, even if you're a rabid Taylor Swift fan, you don't really care about her political opinion that much. Maybe there are a handful of super fans that if they hear Taylor Swift talk about politics, they say, okay, well, Taylor Swift likes this candidate, so I'm voting for them. But I doubt there are a whole lot of people that were just dying for her political commentary to be available on this new album. I'm different. I'm a political commentator. People actually want to hear my opinions on things. That's the reason I'm here. And it's also the reason that I am far, far poorer than Taylor Swift, because what I do is not nearly as popular and probably shouldn't be. But the point is, this is not something that Taylor Swift fans were vying for. This was not something that they're looking out for. And I'm going to go ahead and predict it. And maybe her new album does really well and she makes a lot of money. I don't begrudge anybody for that. That's the free market system. But she needs to be careful. Because many a person has been either destroyed or their career greatly inhibited by their political agendas. A lot of the newer movies that, like Captain Marvel or Atomic Blonde, that try really hard to push that social justice warrior narrative, wind up falling on their face. Because they made the politics more important than the entertainment. And if Taylor Swift falls into that, if they start doing politics first and entertainment second, they're going to find themselves not nearly in the cushy position that they've been in up until now. Look at Saturday Night Live or a lot of the late night talk shows. For the longest time, they just made fun of everybody. And it was really funny to watch them making fun of it. I mean, Dana Carvey as George W. Bush is hysterical. I don't care what anybody says. I laugh at that till I cry. But now what has happened in a lot of those venues is that they've made the political message more important than getting the laugh or singing music that people like. It's going to come back to bite them in the butt. And I don't have any personal animus towards Taylor Swift, even though she and I don't agree much on politics. But if she's not careful, same thing's going to happen to her. It is far wiser from a business perspective, at least. Not making a stance on it from a moral or immoral perspective, because I don't think that applies here. But strictly from a business perspective, this was a really dumb move. I don't know of anybody that really wants to go to a Taylor Swift concert so that they can hear her opinions on politics. Keep in mind that she got to be the massive, massive superstar that she is today without saying anything about politics. This is not something that's going to bolster her career. This is not something that is going to make a big difference in the political realm. The only impact that this is even likely to have is that she's going to lose some fans in the process. And I'm not wishing that on her. I don't want her career to be terrible or anything like that. I'm just saying that this is a really bad move on her part. Now, I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that she is big buddies with rabid leftists like Lena Dunham, who, by the way, also did something stupid this week. She actually posted naked pictures of herself to promote positivity and loving yourself. Those are her words, not mine. First of all, I don't know of anybody that feels positive after seeing a naked picture of Lena Dunham, because, yeah. Ugh. But nonetheless, her message doesn't make any sense either. Because somebody that is really positive about who they are, very secure in themselves, and somebody that really loves themselves, they don't have to do stupid stunts to get attention. They don't have to run out in the middle of the street yelling, "Hey everybody, look at me, look at me." Lena Dunham starves for attention. She craves it, and she can't stand it when she's not getting any, so she pulls random crazy stunts like this to get back into the spotlight. Somebody that's really secure in who they are, really positive about the direction their life is going, and who really does love themselves, they don't have to do stupid stuff like this. And Taylor Swift would do well to get as far away from Lena Dunham as humanly possible. And that would be true regardless of her political stance. Nobody should be anywhere near Lena Dunham while her mouth is moving. Because goodness knows nothing productive ever comes out of it. All right, so we've already done the chaplain's report, so that's going to be the show for today. Stay the course, friends.
Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Any opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media. The theme song for Tactics is 6 Foot Town by Big and Rich. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Broadcast studios provided by Cumulus Media Montgomery. Location studios provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ.